In the early morning hours of December 31st, 1999, a retiree living in Del Rio, Texas, was waking up at 4 in the morning. As he lay there, he hears a knocking at his front door and gets up to investigate, wondering to himself who would be knocking at my door this early. As he gets to the door, he asks who's there, but is only responded to by more knocking. He says again, who's there? Again, more knocking. He looks through the peephole, and what he sees horrifies him. You're a fan of disturbing stories? Then you've come to the right place. I'm Joe, and this is Undeniably Disturbing. Two girls, Katie Harris, age 13, and Krystal Surles, age 10, and their families had become good friends while living in Kansas City. In 1995, Katie Harris and her family moved from Kansas City to Del Rio, Texas. The Harris family made friends and connections in their new community. They attended Grace Community Church, where Mr. Harris befriended many of the parishioners and counseled with some that were troubled with relationships and other issues. Even though miles apart, Katie's and Krystal's families remained close. The Harrises invited Krystal and her family to visit from Kansas City. During the trip, Krystal's mom, Pam, announced that they too would be moving to Del Rio. The girls were so excited. Pam asked Katie's dad, Terry, if he would be willing to help them move all of their belongings from Kansas City back to Del Rio, and Terry Harris agreed. On December 30th, 1999, at around 6 p.m., Terry Harris, Pam Surles, and her boyfriend, Doug Luker, who had come on the trip with them to visit, set out on the journey to Kansas City. Mrs. Harris remained at home with the Harris and Surles children. The trip to Kansas City was about 13 hours. On their way out of town, Terry, Doug, and Pam stopped at a gas station right outside of Del Rio to fill the truck up. At the gas station, Terry saw a fellow church member that he had frequently counseled in his home. Terry spoke to him briefly about the trip that they were about to take and how grateful he was to have a truck that he had bought from this man who was working as a used car salesman at the time. And this was able to help his friends move from Kansas City back to Del Rio. Now, back at the Harris home, the two girls were excited about the coming new year and the prospect of Krystal moving to town. While making sleeping arrangements that evening, Krystal's little sister, Marquis, wanted to sleep in the same room with her sister, Krystal, and Katie. She even volunteered to sleep on the floor if necessary, but Katie and Krystal just wanted to be together, the older girls. Katie's mom suggested that Marquis sleep in the room right across the hall. Losing this argument would later prove to be a matter of life and death. With everything settled, the older girls settled into normal teenage banter about Britney Spears and NSYNC before drifting off to sleep. On December 31st, 1999, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., while the Harris household occupants slept, a car would silently make its way into the driveway of the double-wide trailer. The driver would get out of his car and began searching for a way to get into the house. The intruder found an open window and climbed in. This intruder found himself in Katie's older brother's room, Justin. Now, Justin happened to be blind, but thinking that the girls were just trying to annoy him, he yells out, "Will y'all stop coming in my room?" The intruder exits Justin's room through the door and continues down the hallway. The intruder looked in several rooms using his cigarette lighter to lead the way, before arriving in the room shared by Katie and Krystal. He got into the bottom bunk with Katie and gently nudged her. Katie slowly began to wake up. She looked at the man in the bunk with her and shouted, "What are you doing here?" The intruder covered her mouth with his hand and then, using a 12-inch boning knife that he had brought with him, cut off little Katie's nightclothes. He started trying to touch Katie in an inappropriate way. She remembered that Krystal was in the room with her and yelled out, "Go get Mama." The intruder jumped up and turned on the light and stood to block the door from Katie being able to get out. She was still processing the situation and noticed that she was bleeding. Indignantly, she shouted, "You cut me." The intruder quickly lunged forward and placed his hand over Katie's mouth. The noise roused Krystal from her sleep. She opened her eyes just in time to lock eyes with her friend Katie at the foot of the bunk beds as the man standing in front of her with his hand over her mouth sliced open her neck, not once, but twice, sending Katie collapsing to the floor, gurgling and gasping and dying. He focused on Katie and stabbed her 16 more times with this 12-inch knife, penetrating her all the way from the front out the back. Frozen with fear, Krystal could only look on. She was in shock of what she was witnessing and had no voice, no ability to move. The intruder moved toward the door as if to leave. However, as he stopped on the threshold and raised his finger to the light switch, he paused and turned and looked one more time, and he sees Krystal. Instinctively, she grabs her own throat and begins to edge herself towards the side of the bed closest to the wall. Calmly, the intruder walks over to her, orders her to remove her hands, and when she lowered her hands, her neck was immediately slashed with the still bloody boning knife. This attack severed Krystal's trachea, rendering her truly without a voice, and nicked her carotid artery. Blood was pouring out of her neck. However, she knew that she had to pretend to be dead, or else her attacker would surely finish the job. Satisfied he had eliminated any witnesses, the intruder turned towards the door, walked to it, opened it, and stepped out. He would leave through the front door, stopping to wipe the doorknob of any fingerprints. After hearing a car leave, and assuming that everyone else in the house is also dead like Katie, Krystal makes her way out of the house to search for help. She sees only one light in the distance and heads in that direction. Fear, confusion, adrenaline fueled her quarter-mile trek to the house with the light. Krystal finally reaches the home of Del Rio retiree Herb Betts. She knocks on the door as hard as she could. She hears a man on the other side asking, "Who's there? Who's there?" She is unable to speak due to her injuries, and she simply continues to knock frantically on the door. Finally, Krystal sees the door open. The man helps her inside and dials 911. As she waits for help, she uses hand gestures to ask for something to write with. Krystal wrote some short notes. "Harrises are hurt. My neck needs help. Tell them to hurry. And will I live?" Based on the injuries he saw, Herb did not believe Krystal could survive, but he tried to reassure her several times that she would be okay while waiting for emergency services. When emergency services arrived, they found Krystal in shock and convulsing. Blood was still coming out of her neck. Emergency services rushed her to the Del Rio hospital. There, doctors decided that she really needed to be airlifted to the hospital in San Antonio. Back at the Harris home, Krystal's little sister, Marquis, wakes up. She's still slightly upset about being sent across the hall, but is ready to see her sister and have some breakfast. She sits up in her bed and sees a strange woman in there telling her, "Put these on, we have to go." As they walked out of the room, Marquis noticed a stream of blood. There was blood on the wall. There was blood everywhere. Marquis knew something bad had happened. Where was Katie and her sister? Emergency services arrived at the Harris home and, of course, discovered the deceased bloody body of Katie Harris. Marquis later understood that losing that fight with her sister saved her life. At the hospital in San Antonio, emergency surgeons worked on Krystal. Her trachea was repaired, and the holes in her neck and her carotid artery were closed. The physical healing could begin. As she woke on New Year's Day, Krystal was met with her first visitor, Texas Ranger John Allen. He had arrived to begin piecing together what had occurred in the Harris home. Her throat heavily bandaged, Krystal was able to use gestures, again to get pen and paper, to describe what had happened to her and Katie. A forensic artist arrived to help create a picture of what Krystal had described. The sketch revealed a dark-eyed, round-faced man with long brown hair and a full beard. Some commented that the image resembled Chuck Norris. The image was circulated by the authorities. The Harris family was pressed to recall anyone that might match this image. However, it was Pam's boyfriend, Doug, who seemed to connect the image to a resident of Del Rio. Doug remembered the man at the gas station as they were heading out on their trip to Kansas City. He remembered him as being a friend of Terry Harris's. Doug told police that he thinks his name was Tom or Tommy. He remembered that the man was a used car salesman. This very helpful information was shared with the Texas Rangers. It turned out, after some investigating, that Ranger Allen would discover this man was a former used car salesman from Del Rio, Texas. His name was Tommy Lynn Sells. Now, Tommy Lynn Sells was a troubled man. And though he went to church and had a pretty good job, he had some serious issues with alcohol abuse. Terry Harris really tried his best to help Tommy out. He counseled him as a friend about his marital problems and even bought a truck from him. Tommy visited the Harris home often with Terry and his family. Little did anyone know that his focus was on 13-year-old Katie. On the morning of January 2nd, police arrived at Sells' residence to take him into custody. Sells went along without incident. He did not say a word, nor did he protest. During the ride to the police station, Sells turned to Valverde County Sheriff's Deputy Lieutenant Larry Pope and said, "I guess we have a lot to talk about." Sells cooperated with law enforcement and admitted to a string of murders across the United States over a period of almost 20 years. Sells even referred to himself by the nickname Coast to Coast, perhaps doing this because of his migratory lifestyle as well as a trail of killings across the country. 22 of the additional murders claimed by Sells have been confirmed. A year later, a brave 11-year-old Krystal Surles, who survived these horrible injuries, testified at the Sells trial. Tommy Lynn Sells was convicted of the murder of Katie Harris and sentenced to death. Terry Harris remarked, "It took 10 minutes for Sells to uproot our family. He stole our daughter's accomplishments every birthday, every holiday. For a whole year, everything snowballed downhill. He stole our lifestyle, Terry would go on to share, "It eats me up that I tried to help Tommy. I talked with him. He was a guy down on his luck, and I tried to help. He repaid me by killing my daughter." The Harrises and Krystal Surles were among those who attended Sells' execution. When asked if he had any final statement, Sells declined, smiled at his supporters. After the lethal injection was administered, he took a few deep breaths, closed his eyes, and began to snore. After less than a minute, Tommy Lynn Sells stopped breathing. He was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. on April 3rd, 2014. Basically, the dude just took a nap, Terry Harris would tell reporters afterwards. Thus ended the life of the self-proclaimed coast-to-coast killer, one of the most prolific serial predators and killers we have known.